Good evening all, and welcome. Cemeteries are the final resting place for many, which can result in many spooky happenings. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. In my youth, I had a few friends that had a band in the local scene, and as anyone who has hung around with the band scene can tell you, you meet all the kinds of strange dudes. This was how I met Marty. Marty was a friend of one of the band members who had just moved into my hometown. At first, the guy seemed pretty cool. He was quite a talented artist and drew all kinds of morbid pictures and murals the band would use in their live sets. He was an oddball, but then which artist isn't? But a cool guy to hang out with, for sure. However, after a while, he started to become unhinged. Marty started getting drunk and expressed his desire to rob a grave. It wasn't because he was a necro or anything. He said it was because he wanted a human skull to use as a model for his artwork. This started becoming something he would continually talk about whenever he got into the source, and eventually the band members got sick of hearing it and called him out. Marty then proceeded to grab a shovel and the keys to his car and asked one of the more sober guys to drive him to a cemetery. Thinking he was full of shite, 3 of the guys got into the car with him and set off to call his bluff. They drove to an old cemetery and dropped off Marty with his shovel and a plastic bag. He instructed them to drive back to the cemetery gates every hour until he returned, and set off into the graveyard. The guys parked the car on a back road and drank a few ales waiting for him to return. Eventually, after the 3rd visit to the cemetery, Marty stood outside the gates waiting. He opened the trunk and put his shovel and something wrapped in a garbage bag inside. He got into the car and told them he had got what he came for. He had dug up an 140-year-old grave and stole the human remains buried in it. When they returned to the house, Marty showed them the skeletal remains he had stolen. This didn't sit well with some of the guys present there, so it didn't come as much as of a surprise when it was all over the news 1 week later after Marty was arrested for grave robbing. It also came out that Marty had issues with beating women. It turned out his girlfriend at the time had heard about the grave robbing and, tired of being used as Marty's personal punching bag, ratted him out with the cops. While he did get off easy for the grave robbing charges, the betrayal from his girlfriend and subsequent harassment he received daily from the local police eventually caused him to leave town for a 2nd time. In the time between being arrested for grave robbing and leaving town, I lost touch with him. His behaviour became increasingly violent and erratic to the point that he was a liability to be hanging around. Eventually, I heard he was arrested a 2nd time on multiple charges, including assault, domestic assault, aggravated assault, assault with a weapon, possession with intent, cultivation and intent and sexual interference with a minor, and a few other charges. I heard he was looking at 12-year-olds, and I can only imagine how crazy he'd be when he is eventually released. All that I do know is that I do own a kick-ass original graphite drawing he made for me that should be worth mint if he ever goes serial. Not that I even hope that. This incident happened to a relative of mine and his younger cousin and some others. My relative is called Dave. He and his wife were in their 20s at the time. and had not been married very long. This incident happened in the 90s. Dave had a younger cousin who was being raised by her grandparents. The grandparents lived out in the country, and there were not a lot of kids her age to hang around with. So he, Dave, and his wife would often invite her along if they were driving into the nearest city to see a movie or play mini golf or something like that. It was the cousin's 13th birthday, and she wanted to have a sleepover. So it was decided it would be at Dave's house, and the cousin invited 5 of her closest friends. Dave and his wife were not all that mature, and when around the kids especially, they would act like kids right along with them. Anyway, they decided later that night to go to a graveyard, I guess just for the thrill or something, as there wasn't much to do in our tiny town. In our small town, the graveyards around this area are located out in the woods. This particular one was surrounded by thick woods, no houses nearby. It was small and had a chain link fence around it, and a street light near the gate where you entered. The caretaker had a street light installed at some point, presumably to deter teenagers from going there to drink and party. Well, Dave, his wife, and the 6 girls all exited the car and walked around the graveyard and were laughing, joking, chasing each other and telling ghost stories, trying to scare each other and just being silly. They finally got tired of playing around and decided to go back to Dave's house. They all went and got back into Dave's large 70 model car. The girls piled into the back, and of course, he, his wife, got into the front. All the females were talking and giggling, just being silly, while Dave, sitting in the driver's seat, was getting ready to crank up the car. While this is going on, they heard a tap on the driver's side window. It was not a tap like someone using their knuckles. It was more like a ting 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 of someone using a light metal object. Everyone looked towards the window, and there was a guy standing there who was holding a machete. The tip of the machete was what he had used to tap the window with. Dave and his wife said the guy was dressed like Rambo. He wasn't wearing a shirt and had some kind of rag tied around his head, and was painted up with green and brown paint. Kind of like, I guess, army guys paint themselves when they go out on maneuvers. Dave assumed it was possibly someone needing help, so he began opening his door to get out and talk to the guy. When he did this, he said his wife and all the girls started screaming no and diving for the door. The girls were diving over the seat and his wife across the seat, etc. They pulled the door shut and locked it and frantically began locking all their doors. Then the girls and Dave's wife all began screaming at Dave, telling him to get out of there. While he was putting the key in the ignition, this strange guy does weird sort of karate moves like you might see on TV. He was spinning the machete around and doing a few kicks. Dave cranked up the car and then took off out of there. Later that night, they rode back to the graveyard to see if he was still there. And of course, this time, they had the doors locked and did not leave the car. They thought they saw someone lying on one of the graves towards the back, but it could have just been a trick of the light. We don't know to this day who the individual was. I believe he was either on drugs or seriously mentally ill. It creeped all of them out, that this very strange guy was probably hiding in the graveyard, watching them earlier, when they were walking around out there, laughing and having fun, totally oblivious to his presence. In the fall of last year, I was walking with my mother in a provincial park that is about a 5-minute drive away from my house. The park is relatively small and has a cemetery in it, which dates back to when the area was first settled in the mid-1800s. On this particular occasion, we were on a trail which I have been on many times before, which passes right by the cemetery. I had decided that I wanted to go in for a minute to look around, as I had not been there in a while. There was a grey sedan parked in front of the gate, which was somewhat unusual, being that the cemetery was so small, old, and out of the way. That doesn't tend to get many visitors, but its presence still wasn't really noteworthy. I climbed over the gate and started strolling around the cemetery, walking up a crest that had the older graves on the other side of it. I heard some scuffling and rustling sounds and figured that they were being caused by small animals, or maybe the owner of the sedan. I wandered through the graves on the other side of the hill until I came to stop in front of one belonging to a little girl named Rosie, who died in 1951 at the age of 3. Someone had dug a hole over where her little body should have been, and it looked pretty fresh. They had covered the mouth of the hole with sticks and other things, like an empty bag of dog food, almost like they were very hastily trying to hide what they'd been doing. I was too scared to move the bag and look in the hole, but from what I could see from the edge of the bag, it looked to be about 4 to 5 feet deep and 3 foot wide. I didn't see anyone else in the cemetery, but it's worth mentioning that the cemetery is surrounded by a fairly dense wood. Needless to say, I did not hang around after the discovery. I ran to the gate where my mum was standing and told her what I'd seen. I asked her if we should call the police or a park ranger or something. She said no, as she didn't want to get involved. But we left the park pretty quickly after that. I still have no idea what was going on there, but it still makes me really uncomfortable to think that there could have been someone lurking around the trees whilst I looked at what they'd just done to that poor dead kid's grave. The area I live in has had its fair share of crime, most of which is meth related, but it's not uncommon to see burnt out rolling meth labs or paraphernalia in the woods. But I've never seen anything like this. All I can think of is that for some messed up reason, someone was trying to dig up that little girl's bones. This story happened when I was around 10 years of age and involved 4 of my childhood friends. In case you didn't know, I am a 28-year-old female, and I'm from a very country southern state. This was the most awful thing I've been through in my life. This story takes place back in the mountains. I was always so excited to see the weekend approaching, partly because I had a very cool mum who would take me places with my friends and pretty much let us have a bit of freedom. The other part is I always get to spend weekends with my friends. So my friend Belinda asked me if she could come spend the weekend with me. I asked my mother, who approved, and I waited until her mother dropped her off at the bottom of my hill and walked down to meet her. We walked excitedly back to my house, and my mum then said to her best friend Chris, who is female, so my mum asked if Belinda and I wanted to go, and we both said yes. Chris's kids are Alan and Jay, who happen to be two of my best friends. Belinda had a crush on Alan, and I was secretly in love with Jay. We left our house, and within 10 minutes, descended into their home. As I said, I live on top of a huge mountain that is very close to dense forest. So after 20 minutes of driving, we finally made it to their house. My mom went in and was greeted by Chris. Belinda and I stayed out to talk with Ellen and Jay, who also had a few other friends with them. We knew everyone there and also joined the conversation. Scott being the oldest, Jay being the second oldest, Ray and then Alan being the youngest. They all kept going on about this cabin they had built far into the woods. It was probably about 3 miles into the forest from their house. The boys wanted us to go down with them to explore it, and we agreed. I was used to roaming half of these woods, and I always loved venturing out into them. I grew up there my whole life, and that all changed after this. We told them we had to ask my mum and use the bathroom before we could go. They sniggered, jumped on their ATVs, screamed that they were going on ahead of us, and tell us to follow when we're done. We go into the house, use the restroom, and ask my mum if we could go. We're in a hurry to catch the boys, and she told us yes, but to be careful. So we race out of the house. We start walking down their hill to descend to the main dirt road. We had to walk approximately half a mile to get to the road that led to the cabin. It was almost all downhill, except for the flat, mainly bottom road. We skipped along merrily, talking about the guys as we were going. They always liked playing pranks and jokes on me, since I was like their little sister and grew up with them. So I told Belinda that I had a feeling that they were going to jump out and scare us or something. Little did I know I was in for a different surprise. We walked around another 2.5 miles to finally reach this cabin. It felt like it took forever, as this wasn't a road but a path. When we finally reach it, no one was in sight. We walk onto the little porch and knock on the door, waiting for one of the guys to jump out and try and scare us. We step back and marvel at the little cabin. Jay did a really good job on it. He was always into building, creating and growing things. We finally check the door and step into a little room. The cabin only had 2 rooms. It wasn't very big at all. No one appeared to be inside or in the general area. All we can hear are the sounds of wildlife. So we stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. It was then that we heard the ATV a little ways away above the cabin. Not back towards the main road, but further down the path. So we follow the sounds and finally see the guys. They're speeding off down the path. Stop long enough to yell at us and keep following them though, and take off down the path of the woods. We both groan very loudly. Belinda expresses concern and just wants to go back the way we came to the house. It was probably around 3 in the afternoon, and she didn't want to be out in the woods anymore. I, on the other hand, was a little explorer and wanted to keep going down the path, thinking somehow that we could find the guys and possibly prank them. Boy, do I regret doing that now. In fact, I think I should have kicked their butts after this little escapade. So we take off further down the path, after I talk Belinda into it. We walk for 2 hours before we both realize that we are lost. We came to a fork in the roads. There stood a tree with 2 arrows pointing to either side of the split in the road. I forgot to mention that it was summertime and the daylight was strong. It doesn't get dark here until around 8ish in the summer, and we had walked for about 2 hours in total, and seriously didn't know which way to go. My friend started to panic a bit, and I tried to calm her down, assuring her that we had plenty of daylight ahead, and that we would make it back in plenty of time, although I wasn't so sure of that. We were about 7 miles into the woods that were endless. At this time, I had no idea of our location, so we both decided to stick towards the right of the mountain. So we took off. Belinda was laughing and saying she was going to kick their butts later. I laughed, and we made a plan to get back at them. We walked for what seemed like forever, and somehow ended up back at the split in the road. It was then growing a little darker, nearing dusk with every minute. By this time, my friend and I were totally freaking out. She was sobbing and asking me, how are we going to find our way back? I tried to stay calm and reassure her that we would make it back, but on the inside, I was just as scared as her. And that time, we stood frozen to the road, trying to figure out where to go next. That's when about 15 yards back, I heard a twig snap. I shushed Belinda and asked her if she heard that. She started smiling and was about to call out for our guy friends. I stopped her suddenly, telling her to stay quiet for a minute. We continued to hear the footsteps. For some reason, I felt more terrified than I ever had in my life. I whispered to Belinda to start walking slowly down the left fork. The footsteps kept inching closer to our location. We tried to be as quiet as we could, but leaves were all under us. For some reason, I knew that these footsteps didn't belong to our friends, and I had the awful feeling of dread, and my friend started to pick up on that. As the footsteps started sounding closer and faster, I decided to book it down this path, and my friend followed suit. I just felt I was running for my life, and that if I slowed down, I was going to never make it back home. We finally reached this embankment off the side of the path, so we decided to climb up it, and I tore into the mountainside with my feet and my legs and scratched myself along the way. We finally could see the barn up ahead of us, which was old and had not been used in a long time. The footsteps still approached us after a short pause. My guess is they were quieter as they reached the mountain. We had also descended into tall grassy fields, which made it easier to mask any sounds. As I finally realized our surroundings, I remembered their family grave was up ahead of the barn. It was very old, and had very old large headstones, as well as some crypts. I decided that was probably our best chance to hide, and get a view of who this person was who was chasing us. So we ran through the old iron gate and hid behind the largest tomb we could find. It grew very quiet as we stood frozen in the graveyard. My mind was racing, my body was shaking, and my heart was beating beyond control. Who was chasing us through the woods? What did they want from us? I had so many questions that would never get answered. Belinda and I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was more like 10 minutes. It gave us a chance to calm down, correct our breathing, and cool down from our run. We finally decided to stand up halfway, so that we could see if anyone were around us. We crept up to our feet, still crouching behind the grave. What we both saw, literally, made us pee our pants. There, at the beginning of the cemetery, stood a man. He was probably around 6 foot tall and appeared to weigh somewhere in the region of 170 pounds, and was wearing dark clothing. His eyes looked very dark and wild as he stood there searching the graveyard with his eyes, trying to listen for us. We both immediately ducked back behind the headstone. We started breathing heavily again, scared to death he saw us raise. Belinda shot me a look as the man started rustling around. I peered up again, and his gaze met mine. He then turned his body towards our hiding place, locked his gaze with me, and smiled a wicked smile. He then said, "There you are." I didn't even hesitate. I screamed to Belinda, and we both jumped up and started running towards the back of the cemetery fence. The man started chasing behind us. Luckily for us, this cemetery had a very short fence, so we hurriedly hopped over and began running in the direction of the house. We ran out of the clearing and reached the gravel road. We didn't slow down, stop, or look behind us. We just ran as fast as we could towards the house. The gravel beneath our feet was very loud. We made it part way there and at the bottom of their road. At that point we saw all the boys looking very worried. We ran up to them so fast that they jumped. I ran into Scott's arms crying, with Belinda right beside me. She was crying too, both of us looking a hot mess, bleeding from the climb earlier, sweaty, and our appearance disheveled. We suddenly turned, remembering the reason for our panic, to see a man running towards the graveyard. Scott, Jay, and Alan, all screaming, chase after him, and we never saw him again. The boys chased him into the woods and couldn't catch up with him, so they came back and walked us up to the house, and they all started crying, feeling very bad for trying to mess with us earlier. Our parents waiting on us scared to death. Jay and the boys admitted to leaving us and taking off into the woods, thinking that we would find our way back. As it grew later, they all began to worry about us and had gone back to search for us. But when they couldn't find us, they all went to our parents and admitted what they did. They all went to search for us and began to panic when they couldn't find us. Chris was actually on the phone with 911 when we arrived, and they were about to send search and rescue down. We had been gone for close to 5 hours, and we told them the story about the man who followed us. The police showed up to question us and ask us for the man's description, and they searched through the woods and mountains, but there wasn't a trace of him. The boys all got grounded for playing their trick. They honestly were all shaken up by it, thinking that they would never see us again, and scared because it was getting dark, and of course because of the man. They felt guilty thinking about him, and thought it was all their fault. Needless to say, we forgave them. I never went back to that cabin, or to any of that part of the woods again. So, creepy woodsman stalker, I hope we never meet again. It's a very old cemetery, a good few 100 years. At least, the church next to it has existed since before the 16th century, considering the fact that it is a remote place as well. Most people back in the day were buried with wooden crosses and such. As time goes on, crosses rot away, new people get buried, etc. Nowadays, due to less people living in the countryside, that cemetery is pretty overgrown. It's a really pretty place, and it's sad. Anyway, so someone was taking care of their relative's grave, and decided to expand the area around the grave for some particular reason. For some reason here, we are not particularly fond of grass, rather a well-leveled ground with Zen gardenish lines made up with a rake. The person removed the grass and were neating the place up with a rake when they raked up white hair from the ground. They freaked out and left, leaving my relative and the cemetery attendant to find out what is essentially hair coming out of the ground. She reported it to the church, and supposedly they reburied the body. They're not even sure how the body could have been that close to the surface. I am in my mid-20s, but due to my father's work, I've been all around the globe. In the space of 11 years, I lived for varying amounts of time in 5 different countries, while visiting about 6 or 7 more. All of this not including my home country, and very short holidays. This, coupled with my bipolarity and functioning insomnia, has me keeping a meticulous journal from the moment I could write and later type. It has also given me a whole truckload of experiences that make me feel lucky. But of course, for all the good ones, there are some bad ones mixed in. For the past 10 months or so, I have worked as a night porter in a pretty well-known hotel in a medium-sized city in the UK. This place has been around for decades and is immensely popular for its funeral teas and wakes, as morbid as that is. This is because it is across the road from one of the larger local cemeteries, about 1 kilometre from one of the larger churches, and to top it all off, less than 3 kilometres from the crematorium, perfectly situated for the mourner's business. So a couple of weeks ago, I was almost finished on my shift when the sweet old guy that is the cemetery's groundskeeper comes in on the verge of tears. Jacob, he is literally the epitome of adorable, and a very kind old man. He volunteered to work there, even when he was retired, because that's how nice he is. Jacob comes in at around 7:50, as I was waiting for the morning shift folks to turn up, so that I could go home. He started blabbering incoherently, as the emotional do. So I told him to calm down, and if he wanted a cup of tea. Obviously that was a yes, so 5 minutes later he sat down with a nice cup of tea, telling me about what's wrong. Some idiots had jumped the fence and overturned a bunch of headstones, spray-painted vile crap on epitaphs, and even partially dug into some of the graves. By the time he'd calmed down, I said my shift was finished and told him that I would help him set the headstones upright at least. This man is too precious, and I had to help. Roll on a couple of hours, and all the stones were back in order, and I went home shattered. Those things are heavy as hell, but I was happy to have helped. I told my work I'd probably be a little late, and they understood. Anyway, I get to my shift a couple of hours late, and as it turns out, I was going to be on my own, after 2 o'clock, as my colleague's second job needed him in early. Ironic because his second job is sandblasting granite headstones. 2 a.m. comes and goes, and everything was almost in order, and I was just adding the finishing touches to a large funeral tea of one of our function suites when I hear a knocking noise. At first, I thought it was someone in the rooms upstairs walking the halls and dismissed it. But the knocking happened again, this time louder, and the third time's a charm. I found the source. One of the fire exits next to the function suite, but more specifically, the fire exit directly across from the cemetery. Obviously, I wasn't going to open the door, and I couldn't even if I wanted to, as they were all alarmed at night. But that didn't matter, as the knocking stopped. Not for long though. The knocking started again from another fire exit close to the car park and front exit. It was much louder now, so I knew exactly where it was coming from straight away. Then it stopped. So, in a bit of minor panic, I sprinted my way towards the front door and made sure it was locked. Then grabbed the night porter's friend from behind reception, aka a walking stick. I could see my visitor's silhouette at the car park, walking slowly towards the entrance. It was definitely a man, at least a foot taller and a little bit broader than me. He was wearing one of those stupid ankle-length goth trench coats with the hood and buckles by the billionfold. He stopped just outside of the light of the front entrance, but he was obviously staring right at me, and I could faintly make out his creepy, shit-eating smile. When he started taking something from behind his back, I braced, thinking what he had in his hand looked like a very large brick or something, so I thought he would smash the front door. But no, he did something far stranger. He just placed the brick thing on the ground slowly at his feet. Then with a weird chipper demeanor, he waved and flashed another toothy predatory grin at me before backing off into the darkness towards the cemetery side entrance. Needless to say, I waited and checked the cameras around the building before venturing out to see what he'd left me. It ended up being one of those small headstone markers with the word, "You forgot this one," spray painted over it in bright green paint. To add even more creep factor, the stone was for a bloody baby's grave, and an old one at that. Not cool at all. So I locked up again and phoned the police. A couple of hours later, a lot of the footage from CCTV was scanned. The police left with a fuzzy frame shot of him that was basically a shape in the dark and nothing else to go by. I have absolutely no idea who he is or was or why he was vandalizing that graveyard. But either way, creepy midnight gothic robber, I hope we don't meet again. And I hope you've put your bizarre and quite frankly disrespectful grave habits behind you, arsehole. My best friend and I worked at a cemetery as groundskeepers when we were juniors and seniors. It was easy money. We got paid $5 an hour, but bear in mind this was in the late 1970s, mostly for edging and trimming and keeping the graves tidy. We raked a lot of leaves. We tore around the place in a souped up golf cart with our tools in the back. It was annoying to work in the rain, and it rained often, but it was truly a gravy job, no pun intended. There were a lot of dead flowers to remove, and a lot of empty beer bottles, beer cans, and used condoms. There was a widow who left scribbled notes torn from a reporter's notebook upon her husband's grave, all of them completely illegible. Also, a lot of sodden stuffed animals. that was sometimes mysteriously muddy on the graves of children. The creepiest thing I saw was a plastic drink and a wet baby doll that was burnt as if someone had gone over it and lit it with a blowtorch. That also had a multitude of big nails driven into its head. I kept the head and hung it from the rear of my car like a graduation tassel. The worst thing I saw, though, was the naked corpse of a young woman my age, a student at a neighboring high school, left neatly with her arms at her side one foggy Saturday morning. She had been strangled right there. Whomever murdered her had also punched her face several times before she was dead. She was identified quickly, but her clothes were never found, and her murder never solved. My friends and I were grilled by the police over several sessions. But what the hell? We didn't do anything. My friend quit a couple of weeks later. I suppose the stress was too much for him, but I hung on until I was around 18, which at that point, I was then eligible to work at my uncle's printing plant. I will never forget the bruises and her open, dead blue eyes. My boyfriend's father owns a property with 2 older houses in a small village. They are side by side and share a yard. His parents don't live in either of them, as the older of the 2 is completely dilapidated inside and is 100% uninhabitable. But they sometimes use the newer, furnished one for laundry. They have always talked about fixing up the older house and renting it out. But Jay and I's current living situation isn't working out. So his parents made us a deal where we fix up the older house for them and then we stay there. So, for convenience, Jay and I have been staying at the first house on weekends while we work on the older place, and some unexplainable things have happened in the past few weeks. Not to mention, I always thought that the place had a certain energy to it that seemed a little off. I used to just brush it off, because the house is empty 90% of the time, and it's not really lived in. But now, I am convinced the weird vibrations are from another source. It all started a few weeks ago on a Friday morning, when Jay and I were drinking coffee and watching a large group of kids get on the school bus in an empty parking lot adjacent from our house. We thought it was great that a bus stop is located so close to the house that we were going to be moving into for when we have kids of our own. This piece is significant because when I took our dog for a walk, a few minutes after the bus drove away, I distinctly heard a young voice yell, "Hello?" My dog's ears perked up, and we both looked around. I was afraid one of the kids had somehow gotten left behind, but there wasn't a single person in sight. So I continued to walk. As soon as I took another step, as if they were watching me, I heard a more persistent, "Hello?" This gave me a chill, and I still didn't see any kids around. Besides, they all should have been on their way to school. The next week, we painted the attic of the old house on a Friday, and the following Saturday, Jay noticed a trail of paint droplets, the exact colour that we used, upstairs on the kitchen floor in the new house. There is no way that could have been from us. We didn't bring any tools or paintbrushes over to the new house or anything else that could have been dripping paint. That evening, when we were leaving to go back home, we were about to back out of the driveway when Jay realized he forgot to lock the front door. He left his driver's side door wide open as he was locking up the house. On his way back, we both watched his door slowly but firmly shut and latch. Note that we were stopped on a slanted part of the driveway, so the door literally swung uphill. This makes me think the spirit is very lonely and does not like it when we leave. Another strange thing that happened, I'm not sure if it could be related or not, is that our dog started limping last Saturday after lying on the couch for a while at the new house. I didn't think much of it. I checked out her paw and didn't see any marks, so I just assumed she'd been laying on it funny, and maybe it fell asleep. But the next morning, it had swollen up to 3 times the size of her normal paws. She couldn't walk on it at all, and got around by hopping on her 3 good legs. I still have no idea what could have happened to her. She didn't leave my sight the whole day. We took her to the vet for an x-ray, and she said it wasn't broken, and she was stumped too. No snake or spider marks either. She gave her pills for the swelling, and it was back to normal in 1 day. I heard of spirits leaving scratches and bruises on people. So, if it were a younger spirit, perhaps they just played a little too roughly with the dog. But here is the kicker. Last night, Jay took our dog for a walk, and they were gone a pretty long time. What happened pretty much confirmed the theory that there is a child haunting us. He said they started by taking the usual route around the block, but when they got to the first corner, she triggered on something and started relentlessly pulling him straight ahead instead of turning. She's a pretty strong pit bull and was acting like it were urgent, so he just let her lead him to see where she wanted to go. She ended up taking him to a cemetery not far from the house that we didn't even know existed. She dragged him to a specific grave and started rolling on it. Jay said the dates on the headstones were 1992 to 1994. After rolling around a bit, she got up, shook off, and casually walked back to the house. Chris, Craig, Jen and I all saw the creature. At the time I was probably around 13. Craig was 14, Jen 15 and Chris 16. We were all males, Chris and Craig brothers, and Jen and I their cousins. But Jen and I are not related. We are, however, very close. It was late August in Plymouth, Ohio, a place known to have some really weird stuff going on, blamed on a cult. I have no reference for this cult or real information about them, but this is our story. We were sitting on the roof at my cousin's house because the window out of Craig's room led right to the first story roof, which was almost flat and had a tree right next to it. So we could sit out there almost every night, that we were together and grabbed these cigar-looking things from the trees. They were a green vegetable-like organic thing, and I think the tree is actually called a cigar tree. We would just throw them and hang out. So, it was a little past midnight. We always stayed up past midnight, and my parents would get mad because I would be so tired the next day when they'd pick me up. I remember there were fireflies out in the field, which was probably 200 feet long and 100 feet wide. On the left of our view there was a country road, as we were in a very rural area, and across the road and down one block was an old cemetery, which my older cousins always told me horrifying stories about, as any older proper cousin should do. On the right side of our view of the field was a small grouping of trees, and then literally a 60-foot straight drop to the river. You couldn't climb it because it was very crumbly and shale. That river was probably cut out over 100 years ago. At the far end of the field from us, there was a pond. It was dug with a bulldozer a few years earlier, and was only about a 15-foot drop. But there was only ever a puddle at the bottom this time of year. The reason I'm giving you these details is so that you can understand the environment. I remember it being pretty bright out, almost a full moon with no clouds. We could see very well, and there was nothing to hide behind in this field. It was wide open to the tree lines that surrounded the property, and the tree lines across the street. Chris had seen the Dogman first. I was talking with Craig and Jen about some video game, and then Jen noticed Chris was staring. Jen followed his eyeline, and that's when Craig and I looked towards the bank. The trees were providing enough shade from the moonlight that it was hard to tell what it was at first. Chris said something along the lines of it being a dog on its hind legs. Then it came out of the dark and started walking in the field. I was frozen solid and couldn't even breathe. It made no sense in my head. It was a German Shepherd head that was attached, or being worn. I couldn't really tell you to this day. He was like drunk. I remember him wearing a plain black t-shirt and dress slacks. He wasn't a scrawny guy, nor was he massive, but rather average build. I'm not sure he could see, but it seemed like he could. He then walked into the cemetery, and I was scared and couldn't move, and Jen yelled out, "Who's there?" The man creature turned and looked at us and started walking directly towards us as we were on the roof. We were probably really easy to spot, and the man didn't say a thing. He didn't run, he didn't even make a gesture towards us. He just came walking. Craig ran up to the window, opened it and climbed in. Jen followed, and Chris grabbed me and pulled me too through the window. When we were inside, Craig told his dad, who was a huge gun enthusiast. His dad, after about 10 minutes, had a shotgun and was putting his boots on to go outside. I remember during the 10 minutes, there was a noise of something pushing on the metallic door, a door opening outside, and a really loud crash, which we couldn't figure out what it was. My uncle went outside and started looking in the field and the graveyard, and being stupid kids, we walked outside the door to see, but didn't go far. That's when I saw blood all over the garage and door handle. The garage wasn't connected to the house, rather about 5 feet across from the house, between the house and a field. My uncle ran around the garage and we couldn't see him. It was horrifying. Some very real horror film. Chris spotted the man again, who looked like he was either laughing or coughing by the way his torso was bouncing on his shoulders. The man jumped over the bank, and by the time my uncle noticed him and got across the field, he was gone into the darkness. My uncle called the cops and told my parents, and no one really gave it much thought. There was a post on a few street lamps about a missing German Shepherd, and a few weeks later, they found a decapitated head of a little girl in the cemetery that was a block away from my cousin's house. The house no longer stands, but I actually drove by the area in 2009. I don't think I could go out there at night anymore, even though I'm 25. I was drunk as hell. I'm walking home from a bar. Between the bar and my house is a pretty large pioneer cemetery. Lots of old graves, big trees, and generally a creepy place. I love the cemetery for the historic graves and quiet, and often take walks through there. In my drunk-ass state of mind, I see the cemetery as a shortcut home. I start climbing the 10-foot chain-link fence, swing a leg over the top, and prepare to jump onto the grass. My pants get stuck. I fall, and I'm literally hanging there, pants ripped, and I fall face first onto the ground. I start walking down the path that leads towards the entrance of the cemetery, which is across from my house, limping and holding my shoulder while drunkenly cursing my foolishness. I hear a noise and look up. It's a teenage couple. They're about 10 yards ahead of me, standing in the moonlight. They flip the hell out, screaming, turning around and running full bore out of there. I can't stop laughing and take my time hobbling home. As I'm approaching the entrance, I notice a car pulling into the cemetery. I suspect it's the cops or someone coming to investigate the screaming, so I duck behind a large headstone. The car is full of more teenagers, and these ones are out for a ghost hunt, packing cameras and audio recorders and the like. Well, screw it. I've already spooked 2 people. I wait until they've walked about 20 yards into the darkness, and I start tossing pine cones while staying hidden. The first pine cone hits the gravel path behind them. The next 2 ricochet off a tree and fly into the graveyard. All the kids freeze and look at each other. Perfect. I toss one more cone and start to make the best evil cackling laugh I can imagine. The kids flip out, run to the car, peel out and flee. I stumble home, laughing my ass off, and enjoy a celebratory joint. I know I'm an asshole, but I just had to mess with those kids. I mean, come on. How could you not? Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. So I hear that YouTube have now confirmed that they do not send subscription notifications to every subscriber, which is strange and, quite frankly, disappointing. So if you want to be informed of my new content every day, please remember to hit the little bell icon next to the subscription button, which you definitely should have pressed, to stay informed of new content. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave it a big thumbs up and drop a comment with your thoughts, as I love reading them. Also, really important news, my friend CZ's World has just released a really nice long video on clueless tourist stories, which is really good, featuring me and some other awesome narrators. Now, it would mean a lot to me if you guys would follow the link on screen or in the description to check this video out. It's some seriously good stuff, all written by him. Oh, and when you go over, please spam his comment section with "Mort sent me here." Please guys, for me. Go on and check it out. I'll hopefully see you there.